In partnership with DailyDoseDocumentary.com and PlatosPeach.com, Timelines in History presents the Second World War. The Richie Boys of World War II. Trained for U.S. Army intelligence at the secret Camp Ritchie facility in Maryland, Richie Boys, as they were known, consisted of some 15,200 servicemen who had fled Germany and Austria when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power in pre-war Germany. 2,200 Richie Boys were Jewish refugees who fled anti-Semitic persecution in Germany, while all the Richie Boys were specifically selected for frontline intelligence gathering due to their fluency in German, French, Polish, and Italian, not to mention their innate understanding of German mentality and behavior. Trained in methods of intelligence, counterintelligence, prisoner interrogation, and psychological warfare, the Richie Boys' role in the war effort became an increasingly vital weapon to the Allies' eventual victory over Germany, working at strategic corps and army levels, analyzing German troop buildups and plans, while studying ways to demoralize the enemy. Many entered Europe with D-Day invasion forces at 5 Normandy beachheads, feeding the Allies with an enormous amount of valuable information against their common enemy, including advance warning of the German Bulge offensive in the Ardennes forest of France. The Richie Boys were also instrumental in softening German resistance by demoralizing them in both open and covert operations, while interrogating prisoners and defectors for information regarding German strength levels and troop movements, as well as assessing the physical and psychological state of the German army. Using targeted disinformation campaigns in German-language newspapers, flyers, and radio broadcasts, the Richie Boys further worked to quell German resistance to invading Allied forces, and while such tactics often proved hard to quantify, in a declassified post-war report by the U.S. Army, the Richie Boys were credited with contributing 60% of all credible intelligence gathered in the European theater of war, making the Richie Boys a vital asset in the Allies' eventual victory over Nazi aggression. The Tuskegee Airmen. During the 1920s and 30s, the bold exploits of record-setting pilots like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart captivated the nation, inspiring thousands of young men and women to seek adventure aloft. But young African Americans who aspired to become pilots met with significant pushback, starting with the widespread racist belief that black people lacked the capacity to learn to fly or operate sophisticated aircraft. At the same time, racial segregation remained the rule in the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as most of the country at large, with military leaders insisting that black soldiers were inferior to whites and performed relatively poorly in combat. In September 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made good on his campaign promise designed to win over black voters, establishing the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, not far from the Tuskegee Institute founded by Booker T. Washington, both institutions nestled smack dab in the heart of the Jim Crow South. Over the course of its existence, the Tuskegee Air Program trained some 1,000 pilots, along with nearly 14,000 navigators, bombardiers, instructors, aircraft and engine mechanics, control tower operators, and other maintenance and support personnel. In April of 1942, the Tuskegee trained 99th Pursuit Squadron deployed to North Africa, where they flew second-hand P-40 Warhawk fighter planes, which were slower and more difficult to maneuver than their German counterparts. After the Nazis were driven out of North Africa, the 99th was moved to Italy, followed by the formation in 1944 of the 100th, 301st, and 302nd Squadron of the 15th Air Force, where they were finally trained to fly the ultimate king of the jungle fighter plane, the P-51 Mustang. Known as the Red Tails, despite their late entry into the war, the Tuskegee Airmen flew more than 15,000 combat sorties over their 2-year wartime engagement, destroying 112 German planes in the air, 237 on the ground, as well as 1,000 rail cars and transportation vehicles, 1 German destroyer, and 40 boats and barges. On the loss side of the spreadsheet, the combined squadron saw 68 Tuskegee Airmen killed in action, while another 32 were captured and made prisoners of war after being shot down. As a group, the Tuskegee Airmen were awarded 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. After their brave service in World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen returned home to a country where they continued to face systemic racism and prejudice. But they did represent an important step forward in preparing the nation for at least the racial integration of the military, which began when Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, which officially desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces and mandated equality of opportunity and treatment for all American servicemen. The Battle of Midway. Six months after the heavy loss of American servicemen and naval assets inflicted by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto became convinced that the Imperial Japanese Navy now enjoyed a numerical advantage over the Americans. Hoping to replicate the success of the Pearl Harbor attacks, Yamamoto sought to annihilate the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet through means of a surprise attack on American naval assets at Midway Island. After a diversionary attack by a smaller Japanese force on the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska, Yamamoto engaged in a 3-pronged attack on Midway. First came air attacks on the island from fighter planes launched by the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiru, and Soru, followed by a naval and infantry invasion of the island. The third phase, after expected reinforcements from Pearl Harbor had been brought in by the Americans, Yamamoto would then lead his own fleet to Midway, after waiting patiently 600 miles to the west. Thanks to U.S. Navy codebreakers, Japan's planned attack was known by the Americans several weeks in advance of Japan's offensive. After a failed counterattack by American B-17 bombers on June 3, 1942, the Japanese air attack of June 4th inflicted severe damage to the U.S. base on Midway, which prompted retaliatory airstrikes by U.S. Devastator torpedo bombers against the 4 Japanese carriers. While Japanese Zero fighters shot down the first wave of American fighters, the second wave hit pay dirt against the Akagi, Kaga, and Soru. After the losses, Japan's surviving carrier Hiru launched 2 attacks on the USS Yorktown aircraft carrier, which had to be abandoned yet remained afloat. After the loss of the Yorktown, U.S. dive bombers took out the Hiru, putting an end to any hopes for a victory in favor of Japan. In the end, the U.S. victory in the Battle of Midway ended Japan's expansionary aspirations in the Pacific, forcing them into a defensive posture until their surrender on September 2, 1945. The Battle of Stalingrad. Considered the industrial heartland of Russia, Adolf Hitler ordered his Wehrmacht to attack and occupy Stalingrad, not just to slow the production of Russian war material, but also for propaganda purposes, since the city was named after Russian dictator Joseph Stalin. After Hitler proclaimed that all the city's male residents would be killed and the women deported, Stalin ordered all Russians in and around Stalingrad to take up arms in defense of the city. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army began their assault on August 23, 1942, but were successfully repelled in skirmishes near the city at a cost to the Russians of nearly 200,000 casualties. Over the next several days, the German Luftwaffe rendered the Volga River impassable for maritime traffic, and by September, the Luftwaffe gained air supremacy over Stalingrad, bombing the city into ruins by the fall of 1942. With less than 20,000 Russian troops in the city and more than 300,000 Nazi and Axis forces closing in, Russian generals called for a massive influx of reinforcements, which effectively encircled Germany's positions in an offensive known as Operation Uranus. Understanding that the Germans were unaccustomed to Russia's harsh winter conditions, along with a daunting 1,200-mile resupply line, the flanking Russians deprived German forces of war material and food. During Operation Little Saturn, the Russians decimated lines of mostly Italian fighters to the west of Stalingrad, yet Hitler refused to surrender even as his troops ran desperately low on food and ammunition. By February of 1943, Russian troops regained control over Stalingrad, taking more than 100,000 German POWs, who for the most part would later die from disease and starvation. Germany's egregious losses at Stalingrad marked the first time that Hitler publicly acknowledged a German defeat in their attempts to dominate Europe, putting Nazi and Axis powers on the defensive for the first time in the war. Many historians believe that the Battle of Stalingrad marked a crucial turning point in the momentum of World War II, paving the way for an eventual victory by the Allies in May of 1945. The Imperial Japanese Navy bombs America. On September 9, 1942, submarine I-25 of the Imperial Japanese Navy surfaced 33 miles off the coast of Oregon, directly abeam of the Cape Blanco lighthouse. As his seaplane was being unpacked and assembled from its hold in front of the conning tower, pilot Nobuo Fujita placed a strand of his hair into a small wooden box. "If I were to die and my body could not be recovered," he recalled after the war, "these remains would be sent back to my wife." When his plane was assembled and on its catapult, Fujita tucked his 400-year-old family samurai sword against the inner sidewall of his cockpit, a tradition he began in flight school. While Fujita would rather have dropped his ordnance on nearby Fort Stevens, his orders were to drop his incendiary bombs into dense Oregon forest, causing an anticipated runaway fire near the small lumbering town of Brookings. With 520 thermite pellets housed in each of his two bombs, Japanese war planners hoped that the resultant 2,700-degree heat from the twin detonations would match the September 1936 fire that destroyed 287,000 acres of Oregon forest, while burning the coastal town of Bandon to the ground. The tactic was also intended to scare the Americans, forcing the U.S. Navy to divert war assets away from the Solomon Islands in defense of the western United States. After catapulting from the submarine's midget flight deck and flying a good ways inland near Mount Emily, Fujita ordered his weapons officer, Soichi Okuda, to drop the first bomb, followed by a second release a mile or so away. The detonations caused multiple clusters of fires, but thanks to the watchful eye of forest fire spotters and a godsend blanket of rain, the fires were quickly extinguished by the combined hand of man and Mother Nature. 20 years after the war, a group of JCs from the Junior Chamber of Commerce in Brookings, Oregon, invited Fujita and his wife to visit, where Fujita made history as the first and last Japanese fighter to reach American soil. And on May 24, 1962, after Oregon Governor Mark Hatfield and President John F. Kennedy approved the goodwill visit, Fujita and his wife Ayako closed another chapter from one of the bloodiest periods in world history. Operation Torch. Given the top-secret nature of Operation Torch, few Americans took notice of the massive buildup of warships, troops, and other weapons of war amassing on the east coast of the United States, throughout the bulk of 1942. Rails and highways bristled with eastbound processions of military might, a massive parade of equipment, supplies, and personnel. Across the pond, British tanks, guns, and troops clogged rail lines in a similar fashion as the two Allied nations prepared for the invasion of French North Africa, intended to draw Axis forces away from the Eastern Front in hopes of relieving mounting stress on a hard-pressed Soviet army. While American war planners had pushed for a landing in Northern Europe, Operation Torch came about as a compromise with British war leaders who felt that a premature D-Day-style invasion of the European mainland would lead to disaster at such an early stage in the war. From November 8th through the 16th, U.S. and British forces engaged General Dwight D. Eisenhower's three-pronged offensive on French North Africa, the western flank at Casablanca, a center prong at Oman, and an eastern offensive at Algiers, with plans for a rapid advance on the German-Italian Africa Corps at Tunis, in conjunction with the second Allied pincer-style advance on Tunis from Egypt. After loosening up shoreline defenses, with varying degrees of Allied naval bombardment, the Western Task Force at Casablanca experienced both heavy resistance and bad weather, eventually capturing French Vichy's primary Atlantic naval base after a short siege, while the Center Task Force suffered damage to some of their ships as they landed in shallow waters, at the same time sinking or driving off all French naval assets. The Eastern Task Force met with even less resistance following an anti-Vichy coup attempt on the day of invasion, leading to the surrender of Algiers on the opening day of the campaign. After 3 years of Axis aggression, which dictated the tempo of Allied defensive responses, the rapid success of Operation Torch marked a turning point moment in the Allies' attempts to push back against Axis aggression, forcing Axis troops to defend both its eastern and western fronts. The invasion force of some 100,000 U.S. and British personnel demonstrated a successful, albeit imperfect, collaboration between British and American war planners, which, if viewed in tandem with the Americans' promising Solomon Islands campaign and the Soviets' ability to hold the Eastern Front, the triumvirate of events positioned the Allies in a significantly better place in late 1942 than they had been in early spring, making Operation Torch a critical breakthrough in the Allies' steady march toward victory. The French sink their own navy. Following the Allies' successful invasion of French North Africa, Nazi leaders reneged on their armistice of 1940 with Vichy France, setting in motion Operations Anton and Lilla with the intent of capturing French warships and submarines for use against Allied naval assets. Long before the Germans set their sights on the French fleet, British and American leaders feared such a takeover by the Nazis, obliging the British to attack the French Navy at Mer el-Kabir on July 3, 1940, followed by the Battle of Dakar on September 23 of that same year. On November 11, 1942, German and Italian troops closed in on the French coastal city of Toulon, home to the French fleet, which triggered Vichy Secretary of the Navy Admiral Gabriel Auffin to order Admirals Jean de Laborde and André Marquis to oppose the invading armies without bloodshed by means of local negotiation. If that failed, his orders went on, then the admirals were obliged to scuttle their ships in port or at sea. Long before the impending attack by the Germans and the Italians, the French Navy had strengthened Toulon's defenses against an anticipated attack by Allied forces, which included a premeditated game plan for scuttling the fleet if an Allied attack was deemed imminent. On November 27, 1942, 4 German combat groups and a motorcycle battalion entered the greater Toulon area at 4 a.m., catching Vichy officers completely by surprise, but not before one of the officers transmitted the order to Admiral Laborde to scuttle the fleet as quickly as possible. "Scuttle, scuttle, scuttle!" the order went out from Laborde's station on the battleship Strasbourg, prompting scuttling crews to set demolition charges and open sea valves on as many ships as possible. The Germans' main force got lost on the foreign roads surrounding Toulon, giving the French a full hour's head start. And when the Germans finally reached the gates of the naval base, French sentries further delayed their entry with the fabricated need for additional paperwork. In the end, of the 164 vessels in the French fleet, 77 were successfully scuttled, while 3 destroyers, 4 submarines, and 39 small ships were captured by the Germans, costing the lives of 12 French combatants and wounding 26 others. The Germans, in turn, would suffer only 1 wounded soldier during the assault on Toulon Harbor. Australia's defeat at Rabaul. After Allied war planners gave up on their objective of establishing a secure fleet anchorage on the South Pacific island of New Britain, deeming the island indefensible under a full-scale Japanese attack, a garrison of Australian troops were tasked with the protection of a Royal Australian Air Force landing field at Rabaul, as well as a flying boat anchorage at nearby Simpson Harbor, assets vital to the Allies' surveillance of Japanese troop movements in the Pacific Theater. Led by RAAF Wing Commander John LaRue, the contingent of men had little offensive capacities, and when the garrison came under Japanese attack on January 4, 1942, LaRue sent RAAF headquarters an old Roman gladiator saying, "Nos morituri te salutamus," or "We who are about to die salute you." On January 20th, over 100 Japanese warplanes attacked Rabaul, quickly knocking out Australian coastal artillery defenses, while forcing Australian soldiers to retreat from Rabaul into the forbidding dangers inherent within the island's jungleless interior. 2 days later, some 3,000 to 4,000 Japanese landed just off of New Ireland, while on January 23rd, an additional 5,000 took control of Simpson Harbor. On February 9th, the Japanese landed a force at Gasmata, effectively severing the Australians' line of retreat, leading to the capture or surrender of more than 1,000 Allied soldiers. Tragically, however, on June 30th, 1942, after some 1,054 Australian and New Zealand prisoners of war had been loaded onto the Japanese merchant ship Montevideo Maru at Rabaul Harbor, bound for a prison camp on the Chinese island of Hainan, the vessel was sighted by the American submarine USS Sturgeon near the northern Philippine coast. While the Maru was initially traveling too fast for a successful torpedo strike, when the ship slowed to 12 knots around midnight, unaware that the ship was carrying Allied prisoners of war, the Sturgeon fired 4 torpedoes toward the transport ship. At least 1 torpedo found its mark, and while the ship went down in 11 minutes' time, those Australians who had escaped the sinking Maru sang Auld Lang Syne to their comrades trapped inside the doomed ship, making the Japanese takeover of Rabaul the worst defeat Australia would suffer during the Second World War. The Batan Death March of World War II. In early 1942, the Japanese bombed Manila after it had been declared an open city, forcing a humiliated Douglas MacArthur to escape the Philippines before his 80,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered at Batan. While the Japanese were woefully unprepared for such a massive surrender, some 50,000 wounded, disease-ridden, and starving Allied prisoners began a disorganized, ill-supplied march through blazing heat to inadequate prison camps 100 miles to the north, kicking off the Batan Death March, which would last for several brutal days to come. To the Japanese, the ancient samurai code of Bushido emphasized death before dishonor, which meant that even before the march began, Japanese soldiers who oversaw the prisoners considered them subhuman and largely worthless. As a result, Japanese soldiers beat Allied prisoners brutally, chopping off fingers to get West Point rings, murdering any man caught with Japanese currency. The men walked in 105-degree heat without water, forcing prisoners to run into carabao wallows, pushing aside the surface scum for a desperate drink of water. The move would prove to be lethal in many ways, since their swallows of tainted water onboarded bacteria such as dysentery and cholera. To fall back or fall out of line was to die beneath Japanese bayonets, bullets, or swords. Strength and perseverance was a prisoner's only path to survival, and when the Japanese hit a given prisoner, his only recourse was to immediately retake his feet. Anyone who failed to get up was killed on the spot. Men helped their weakened comrades to keep their feet and stumble onwards toward the camps. The death toll would have been much higher if not for the brave Filipinos along the route, who attempted to give the prisoners water and sugar when the Japanese weren't looking. Those who were caught were instantly executed. The movement of Batan prisoners to camps in the north began on April 9, 1942, and lasted for several days to come. Exact death toll numbers can only be estimated, with likely figures in a range from 5,650 to 18,000 lives. By the end of the war, being a prisoner in the Imperial Japanese Army would prove to be 17.5 times more lethal than fighting them. While Allied prisoners held by the Germans saw an approximate 4% death rate during the course of the war, those in Japanese custody saw a pronounced jump in mortality figures to 27%. General MacArthur's mess-up in Manila. After Lieutenant General Douglas MacArthur was informed about Japan's deadly attack on Pearl Harbor, the commander of all American forces in the Philippines failed to launch a counteroffensive against the Japanese Empire, some 300 nautical miles away, despite persistent appeals from Army Air Corps Major General Lewis H. Brereton. 7 hours later, when MacArthur at long last approved an attack on Japan, his orders would come way too late. Despite Brereton's orders to keep his bombers aloft and out of reach from Japanese bombardment, at 12:30 p.m., Brereton's B-17 Flying Fortresses were on the ground at Clark Field, being refueled and loaded with bombs for what he hoped would be an eventual attack against Formosa. In keeping with misfortune and bad timing, 88 Japanese bombers and fighters attacked the airdrome, destroying 12 of Brereton's 17 heavy bombers, while damaging the remaining 5 so severely that no planes were left capable of flight. In MacArthur's defense, his troops in the Philippines were undersupplied and undertrained, yet MacArthur's indecision would ultimately be a costly one when in March of 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur's evacuation from the Philippines before the island chain's imminent loss to Japanese invaders. And while MacArthur's retreat was a successful one, the same could not be said for some 78,000 American and Filipino troops on Batan and 11,000 more on Corregidor Island. All would be forced to surrender to an overwhelming incursion force of Japanese fighters, whose eventual inability to contend with so many prisoners of war would lead to the brutalities inflicted on American POWs during the now infamous Batan Death March. After the war, MacArthur attempted to explain his baffling conduct, but none of his words held much water in light of the truth. He claimed that his orders prohibited offensive action unless and until the geographic boundaries of the Philippine Islands had been invaded, but in truth, his orders were not to attack until Japan committed the first overt act of aggression. Clearly, Japan's unsolicited attack on Pearl Harbor constituted the requisite first overt act, which means it was unlikely that MacArthur, a brilliant man and a master wordsmith, misunderstood such a clear and direct order. In the end, his poor decision-making did little to sully his reputation as a bold military commander, and on October 20th, 1944, a few hours after his troops overwhelmed Japanese forces on the Philippines, MacArthur waded ashore on the island of Leyte, declaring in a radio broadcast, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." Ernie Pile, America's eyewitness to war. Unquestionably the most famous and beloved American war correspondent of World War II, Ernie Pile's distinctive folksy writing style brought the horrors of war into living rooms throughout the United States. Embedded with frontline troops in the European theater of operations from 1942 to 1944, Pile wrote about ordinary dog-faced infantry soldiers, which he called the underdogs of World War II. Through his heroic reporting, Pile became friends with enlisted men and officers alike, as well as war leaders such as Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower. After returning stateside to shake off a severe case of battle fatigue, Pile returned to the trenches in 1945, this time in the Pacific Theater of Operations. Reinforcing his status as the dog-faced GI's best friend, Pile wrote a column from Italy in 1944, proposing that soldiers in combat should get fight pay just as airmen receive flight pay. In May 1944, Congress passed a law that became known as the Ernie Pile Bill, authorizing 50% extra pay for combat service. Syndicated in over 400 daily and 300 weekly newspapers, his most famous column was the death of Captain Wascow when he was reporting from Anzio during the invasion of Italy. "I don't know who that first dead man was," he wrote. "You feel small in the presence of dead men, and ashamed at being alive, and you don't ask silly questions." He further wrote that as dead soldiers were brought down a mountain from the front lines, one of them that was laid out in the dim moonlight was much beloved Captain Henry Wascow of the 36th Infantry Division. Pile wrote, "Then a soldier came and stood beside the officer and bent over, and he too spoke to the dead captain, not in a whisper but awfully tenderly, and he said, 'I sure am sorry, sir.' Then the first man squatted down and he reached down and took the dead man's hand, and he sat there for a full 5 minutes, holding the dead hand in his own and looking intently into the dead face, and he never uttered a sound all the time he sat there. And finally he put the hand down, and then he reached up and gently straightened the points of the captain's shirt collar, and then he sort of rearranged the tattered edges of the uniform around the wound, and then he got up and walked away down the road in the moonlight, all alone." When Pile was killed during the Battle of Okinawa, April 14, 1945, President Harry S. Truman said of the gutsy reporter, "No man in this war has so well told the story of the American fighting man as American fighting men wanted it told. He deserves the gratitude of all his countrymen." Pile's wife Jerry would die later that same year from complications of influenza. Hitler wants a wall. As early as December 1941, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler ordered that plans be drawn up for the construction of an Atlantic wall, which would ultimately set off a monumental effort to create defensive fortifications along the entirety of the west coast of Europe. Work began in the spring of 1942, and by April of the following year, almost 250,000 conscripted French laborers were at work building massive coastal fortifications, batteries, mortars, and defensive masonry walls capable of stopping or at least slowing a mechanized invasion from the sea. From the tip of Norway to the Spanish border, every beach along nearly 2,000 miles of coastline was to be made impassable. Naval guns were housed in what the Nazis believed to be indestructible bunkers, while behind the Atlantic Wall, tracks were laid for railway guns capable of hurling shells as far away as England. In the fall of 1943, Hitler became even more convinced that an Allied invasion along the Atlantic coast of Europe would soon become an inevitable reality. Known as the Desert Fox, Hitler ordered Rommel to undertake an inspection of the Atlantic Wall defenses and to prepare for what Hitler believed would be a decisive engagement between Allied and German forces. Believing also that the invasion would be launched across the Straits of Dover against the Pas-de-Calais region, Hitler ordered this sector to be given priority over other sectors of the Atlantic Wall construction project. But by mid-1944, while fortifications in and around the Pas-de-Calais region were deemed completed, other sectors were far from ready for an impending Allied invasion, particularly in and around Normandy, France. As a result of this defensive frailty, on June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy took place at 5 beachheads known as Omaha, Juneau, Utah, Gold, and Sword. Supported by 6,939 naval warships and landing craft, around 156,000 Allied soldiers and paratroopers landed on D-Day, while a total of 1.5 million Allied troops would flood into Europe via the Normandy beachheads by the end of the week. 10,500 Allied troops would be killed, wounded, missing, or made prisoner of war by the end of the first day, while the Germans would suffer a nearly equal number of casualties. 10 months later, Allied troops would storm the Nazi capital of Berlin, ending 6 years of bloodshed that cost the lives of 75 million people. The Code Talkers of World War II. Pioneered by the Cherokee and Choctaw people during World War I, the Code Talkers of World War II were an elite group of Native Americans who played a key role in the Pacific, European, and North African theaters of war. Fighting with the United States Marine Corps, the estimated 500 Code Talkers' primary mission was to encrypt and decrypt vital battlefield communications using their native languages, which left their Nazi and Japanese adversaries unable to eavesdrop on Allied communications, troop movements, and offensive strategies. While the majority of World War II Code Talkers came from the Navajo Nation, they also included soldiers from the Lakota, Meskwaki, Mohawk, Comanche, Tlingit, Hopi, Cree, and Crow people. By way of example, a total of 14 Comanche Code Talkers took part in the D-Day invasion at Normandy, employing a vocabulary of over 100 code terms from their native language. A tank was defined as a turtle, while a bomber was a pregnant airplane. A machine gun was a sewing machine, while Adolf Hitler was a crazy white man. On June 6, 1944, 2 Comanche Code Talkers were embedded with each regiment that landed at Utah Beach, while their counterparts were assigned to the 4th Infantry Division headquarters, where they decrypted codes radioed from the beachhead. Many were wounded during the D-Day offensive known as Overlord, although thankfully none were killed. The Code Talkers Recognition Act of 2008 was signed into law by President George W. Bush on November 15th of that same year, honoring each surviving member with a Congressional Gold Medal. The Code Talkers' work was a key factor in the victories at Iwo Jima and Saipan, along with several other major battles in the Pacific Theater. Credited with saving the lives of thousands of Allied personnel, the Code Talkers' encryption techniques comprise the only military code never to have been broken. British airmen crash a Nazi party. On the 10th anniversary of Hitler's ascension to power, the British Royal Air Force sent 3 twin-engine bombers on the RAF's first-ever daylight bombing raid over Berlin, with the intention of disrupting Luftwaffe commander Hermann Göring's pep talk to a war-weary German public. At 11 in the morning, when Göring was scheduled to address a parade from the Air Ministry building, 3 de Havilland Mosquito bombers, known affectionately by the Brits as the Mossy or the Wooden Wonder, flew a daring low-altitude bombing raid over central Berlin, prompting one eyewitness to later report that Göring was boiling with rage and humiliation, since the successful mission completely discredited Göring's claim to the German people that enemy aircraft would never fly over the Reich. To further the hurt, During the afternoon of the same day, 3 more Mossies from the 139th Squadron bombed Berlin's largest indoor sports arena, where Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels was scheduled to address the day-long celebration of the Nazis' rise to power. Of the 6 Mossies flying over Germany that day, 105th Squadron leader D.F. Darling and his navigator William Wright were shot down near Altengrabo, Germany, taking the lives of both brave men. After the humiliating attacks, Göring would say that it makes me furious when I see the mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knocked together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again. A big week for the Allied air war in Europe. When military aviation came of age during the interwar years between World War I and World War II, a group of air war leaders and strategists known as the Bomber Mafia developed bombardment tactics and aircraft that would forever change the face of warfare. Before any planned considerations for an invasion of northern France could be considered, the Luftwaffe, or German Air Force, had to be destroyed, both in the air and on the ground. All parties agreed that Operation Overlord, as the D-Day invasion had been codenamed, would suffer an egregious loss of life should the Luftwaffe maintain its ability to strafe Allied combatants as they made their way ashore. As a result, Allied air war leaders stuck it to the Nazis during Operation Argument, or what has commonly become known as Big Week. With the arrival of the P-51 Mustang into the skies over Europe, long-range heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator now enjoyed fighter protection all the way to and beyond the IP, or initial point, which is the point in a mission when bomb groups tighten their formations to better defend against German fighter attacks. During Big Week missions flown from February 20th through the 25th, 1944, 8th Air Force Commander General Jimmy Doolittle overcame Germany's reluctance to engage Allied fighters by attacking key aircraft factories that the Luftwaffe could not afford to lose. In addition, Allied fighters were ordered to abandon the bombers with the primary goal of shooting down enemy fighters. In effect, the primary purpose of the bombing missions was to bring up the Luftwaffe, while the real role of the Allied bombers was to be used and sacrificed as bait. During Big Week, the Americans flew missions against airframe and assembly plants over numerous German cities, including Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Steyr, dropping roughly 10,000 tons of bombs. The 8th Air Force, flying out of England, delivered 3,000 sorties at a loss of 97 Fortresses and 40 Liberators, with another 20 heavy bombers scrapped due to damage. Each downed aircraft would cost the Allies 10 to 11 men. The much smaller yet still forming 15th Air Force, flying out of 21 air bases in southeastern Italy, would fly 500 sorties, losing 90 heavy bombers, while the British RAF Bomber Command lost 131 bombers during their nightly raids over Germany. While the number of U.S. aircrew kills on German fighters is most likely wildly exaggerated in the heat of battle, nearly 500 reported kills, Big Week was considered a significant contributor to the Allies' official pronouncement of air superiority over the Luftwaffe in March of 1944. The D-Day invasion at Normandy. Codenamed Operation Overlord, but often referred to as D-Day, the June 6, 1944 invasion of 5 Normandy beachheads would prove to be the largest seaborne invasion in the history of human warfare. Confident that an Allied invasion attempt of Nazi-occupied Europe would come somewhere in the western seafronts facing Great Britain, from 1942 to 1944, Hitler built a coastal defense and fortification system known as the Atlantic Wall, which spanned 1,600 miles of coastline from Belgium to the northern border of Spain. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Allies conducted a substantial military deception plan known as Operation Bodyguard, designed to mislead the Germans as to the date and location of the main Allied landings. While the original D-Day invasion was set for June the 5th, bad weather forced General Dwight D. Eisenhower to delay the operation by 24 hours, which nearly triggered a further delay of 2 weeks, since the invasion planners had strict requirements that coincided with the phase of the moon and subsequent high tides associated with a full moon, conditions that aligned on only 2 days per month. The amphibious landings were preceded by extensive aerial and naval bombardment, followed by the landing of 24,000 airborne troops shortly after midnight on June 6. Allied infantry and armored divisions began landing on the coast of France at 6:30 that same morning, spanning a 50-mile swatch of Normandy beachheads known as Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The men landed under heavy fire from Nazi gun emplacements overlooking the beachheads, which were strewn with landmines and metal tripods to further slow the Allied troop advances. Comprised of 8 Allied navies, the invasion fleet was made up of 6,939 vessels, including 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary craft, and 864 merchant vessels. Around 156,000 Allied soldiers and paratroopers landed at Normandy on June the 6th, while a total of 1.5 million troops would flood into Europe via the Normandy beachheads by the end of the week. 10,500 Allied troops would be killed, wounded, missing, or made prisoner of war on that first invasion day, while the Germans would suffer a nearly equal number of losses. Kamakazi attacks of World War II. On June 20th, 1944, after losing over 400 carrier-based fighters during the 2-day Battle of the Philippine Sea, not to mention losing its geographic defense line between Japan's oil fields in Southeast Asia and the Japanese Empire, Captain Motohara Okumura proposed kamikaze suicide tactics to his superior officers. Known as body attacks or tai-atari in Japanese, kamikaze planes were modified fighters loaded with high explosives intended to maximize damage on enemy naval vessels, with a particular emphasis on sinking Allied aircraft carriers. While the Japanese war machine suffered from diminished industrial capacity as well as inferior fighter planes compared to the American-built Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Foyt F-4U Corsair, Japan's samurai bushido code of death before defeat made kamikaze attacks a favored go-to tactic in the months leading up to Japan's surrender. Meaning divine win or spirit win, Japan's kamikaze program accelerated after the October 25th sinking of the American aircraft carrier St. Louis, quickly expanding to over 2,000 flying bombs by the end of the year. An Allied naval defensive tactic known as Big Blue Blanket was quickly ushered into place, which established Allied air supremacy well away from the main carrier task force. Utilizing a line of picket destroyers and destroyer escorts sailing at least 50 miles out from the main carrier force, the Allies were able to provide early radar interception of inbound kamikaze fighters, which allowed for improved coordination between fighter direction officers on board Allied aircraft carriers. Despite these defensive measures, however, 19% of kamikaze attacks resulted in successful strikes on Allied warships, resulting in the deaths of over 7,000 Allied naval personnel. On the collateral side of things, 3,912 kamikaze pilots sacrificed their lives in what would prove to be a last-ditch Hail Mary before Japan's eventual surrender after the Allies dropped nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The July 20 plot. Before the outbreak of World War II, attempts by German resistance groups to assassinate Adolf Hitler had all but failed in ending the dictator's life, leading Hitler to become increasingly paranoid over the recurring threats to his life, adding layers of armed guards for his protection, while frequently making last-minute changes to his schedule. As war raged throughout Europe, a group of high-ranking German military leaders began to recognize that Hitler's suicidal two-front war would lead to the total destruction of Germany at the hands of advancing Allied forces, opting instead for yet another assassination attempt before staging a coup d'etat against remaining Nazi leaders. Led by Generals Ludwig Beck, Friedrich Olbricht, Henning von Tresckow, and Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Stauffenberg, during a planned meeting at Hitler's Wolf's Lair bunker on July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg planted a briefcase packed with high explosives under a conference table to be used for the upcoming high-level meeting with the Fuhrer, departing the room on a trumped-up story about taking an important phone call. Unbeknownst to Stauffenberg, another officer moved the briefcase away from Hitler's seat before the bomb detonated at 12:42 that afternoon. 4 people were mortally wounded, while Hitler suffered only minor injuries, remaining well enough to keep an appointment with Benito Mussolini before giving the Italian dictator a tour of the bomb site. In the aftermath of the attempted assassination, Stauffenberg and Olbricht were arrested and executed the following day, while some 200 others were eventually tried and executed for treason against the Nazi regime. Erwin Rommel was also linked to the plot, but was given the choice of standing trial or committing suicide in an effort to spare his family. Opting for the latter, the Nazis covered up the true cause of death for the renowned field marshal before honoring him with a state funeral, making the July 20 plot a near miss for the Allies' fight against Nazi aggression. Operation Aphrodite goes horribly wrong. First proposed by Major General Jimmy Doolittle in the later years of World War II, the Americans drummed up a somewhat daring plan to repurpose B-17 heavy bombers that had been taken out of operational service due to wear and tear, turning them into remote-controlled flying bombs against hardened German defenses. Codenamed Operation Aphrodite, the idea was to pack aging flying fortresses, known as Weary Willies, with high explosives, arranging for a skeleton crew to fly the plane to predetermined targets before handing flight control over to remote pilots flying behind them. With the crew safely parachuting from the plane, the remote control pilot would then crash the converted bomber into a strategic target of interest, causing a massive leveling explosion without the potential sacrifice of Allied airmen in the process. Of the 15 missions flown during Operation Aphrodite, a plane flown by Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. on August 12, 1944, went horribly wrong. The son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, not to mention brothers Jack, Robert, and Edward, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. of the 8th Air Force piloted his Fortress on a course bound for the U-boat pens at Heligoland, Germany. With 21,170 pounds of Torpex high explosive on board, just as Kennedy and co-pilot Wilford John Willey were about to bail out of the plane, 2 back-to-back explosions scattered human remains and plane parts over a 5-mile stretch of English countryside. 8 more missions would be flown through January 1st of 1945, but the missions were deemed largely unsuccessful because their targets were either overrun by Allied ground advances or taken out by conventional fighter attacks or strategic bombing missions. The liberation of Paris. Upon word of the approach of General George Patton's Third Army towards the outskirts of Paris, The French forces of the interior, part of the French resistance, staged an uprising against the German garrison occupying the city. 7 weeks after Operation Overlord and the D-Day invasion of Normandy, on the night of August 24, 1944, elements of General Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division made their way into Paris shortly before midnight. The next morning, they would be joined by the bulk of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, whereupon Wehrmacht Commander Dietrich von Choltitz surrendered to the French at the Hotel Maurice, the newly established headquarters of General Charles de Gaulle of the victorious French army. Despite scattered attempts at scorched earth and sabotage by the retreating Wehrmacht forces, when elements of the French, British, and American armies poured into the city, Parisians responded with cheers, wine, and kisses. Allied airmen flying low over the city saw little material damage, but after 4 years of German uniforms, jackboots, swastikas, and Nazi salutes, Parisians were swept away by a tidal wave of jubilation and relief. Approaching Notre Dame Cathedral by way of the Hotel de Ville, snipers opened fire at General de Gaulle's motorcade. People in the crowds crouched down or ran for cover, while de Gaulle himself largely ignored the threat. When the snipers were put out of action, the city would see 4 straight days of celebration and parades. Vive Paris! Vive de Gaulle! Vive la France! Operation Reunion. When the Soviets swept into Romania in late August 1944, the subsequent release of 1,162 captured Allied airmen sent a wave of optimism throughout the 15th Air Force in Italy, as well as a major morale boost for the American public back home. Operation Reunion stands to this day as one of the high-water feel-good moments of World War II. As the highest-ranking prisoner of war in Romania, Lieutenant Colonel James A. Gunn promptly received permission to organize the repatriation of Allied POWs to their British and Italian air bases. Gunn teamed up with Constantine Cantacuzino, a 38-year-old Romanian prince who commanded the 9th Fighter Group for the Romanian Air Force. Bazou, as he was known to his friends, cut a dashing figure with his movie star good looks and vibrant personality. Before the war, Bazou had captained the Romanian hockey team, broken an automobile speed record between Bucharest and Paris, and later won a national aerobatics championship that elevated him to superstar status in Romania. Adored by women, according to one of his friends, Bazou had his pick from countesses to cooks. With Gunn wedged into the cramped radio compartment of Bazou's German-built Messerschmitt 109, with American flags hastily painted on both sides of the fuselage, Bazou flew the pair into Gunn's home airbase at San Giovanni, Italy, delighting an audience of 15th Air Force personnel when the much-loved commanding officer emerged from the tiny single-seat fighter. 56 B-17s were mustered for the airlift of POWs, flying into Romania in 3 waves of 12 bombers each, timed to arrive in Bucharest at 1-hour intervals. A total of 739 POWs were repatriated on August 31st, while the remaining 393 prisoners would fly home on September 1st, including 12 ambulatory patients on stretchers. The final stragglers who had evaded capture in Romania would be flown home on September 3rd, closing out Operation Reunion with a total of 59 Fortress sorties, 94 Lightning sorties, 281 Mustang sorties, and 1 C-47 sortie, repatriating a total of 1,127 Americans, 31 British airmen, 2 Dutch naval officers, 1 French soldier, and a Romanian stowaway with shaky claims to American citizenship. Back at their respective bases, half-starved POWs slowly came back to life. Operation Market Garden. With the intent of hastening the end of war with Germany, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery devised a plan to create a 64-mile salient or bulge along the northern end of the Germans' thus far impregnable Siegfried Line in the Netherlands, establishing a massive offensive opening for an Allied push into the industrial heartland of Germany's Ruhr Valley. Codenamed Market Garden, the market part of the operation called for 3 airborne divisions to land men and equipment by parachutes and gliders, while ground forces, the garden half of the plan, would cross 6 formidable water obstacles, seizing vital territory and bridges on their push to the Rhine River. Plagued by mistakes from the operation's first engagement on September 17, 1944, some 10,000 British and Polish troops from the British 1st Airborne were dropped miles from their objective at Arnhem due to heavy German anti-aircraft defenses around the city. Fewer than 800 men would reach the Arnhem Bridge, while the rest were forced into a pocket by 2 German panzer divisions near the village of Oosterbeek. To add to the operation's problems, bad weather and a shortage of transport planes slowed the buildup of Allied troops on the ground, landing men over a 3-day buildup period instead of all at once, which negated any chance for an overwhelming assault against dug-in German forces. To make matters worse, radio communication was made useless by flat-wooded landscapes and spread-out landing zones, further dampening Allied attempts at a coordinated offensive. Allied ground relief columns led by Britain's XXX Corps discovered that roads leading up to Arnhem were too narrow for adequate tank passage, made worse by German infantrymen who picked off 9 leading British tanks with anti-tank weapons, further limiting Allied progress to a mere 8 miles during their first day on the ground. The slow Allied advance gave Germany time to strengthen its defenses, which effectively stalled Allied ground troops near the town of Nijmegen, while the British X-Corps suffered crippling losses at Arnhem. With the main objective of Operation Market Garden lost by September 24th, of the approximate 10,600 Allied troops who pushed their way north across the Rhine, only 2,700 would retreat in failure on September 25th, after suffering 7,900 casualties in their failed offensive over the 9-day battle that made up Operation Market Garden. While seizing much of the Netherlands from German control, the Allies would see more than 17,000 casualties, while the Germans suffered 8,000. If Operation Market Garden had gone as planned, military historians believe that World War II in Europe could well have ended before Christmas of 1944, but instead, the conflict in Europe would drag on for another 5 long months, until Soviet troops overtook Berlin in May of 1945, making Operation Market Garden one of the worst Allied blunders of the Second World War. The Battle of the Bulge. Called the greatest American battle of the war by Winston Churchill, the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes region of Belgium was Hitler's last major offensive in World War II against the Western Front. Lasting 6 brutal weeks in raw winter conditions from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, some 30 German divisions attacked battle-weary American troops across 85 miles of densely wooded forest. When the Nazis' unexpected offensive swept into the Ardennes, The Allied line buckled and pulled back in the appearance of a large herniated bulge, which gave the battle its everlasting name. The formerly serene region of Ardennes was hacked to pieces by brutal fighting against the German advance at St. Vith, Elsenborn Ridge, Helfalize, and Bastogne, leading U.S. Army soldier Charlie Sanderson to write of the event. "Did you ever see land when a tornado's come through? Did you ever see trees and stuff twisted and broken off? The whole friggin' forest was like that." Belgian townspeople put away their Allied flags and brought out their swastikas, not knowing which side would ultimately win the battle. Hitler's mid-December blitzkrieg banked heavily on the strategic nature of bad weather, subjecting American troops to freezing rain, thick fog, deep snowdrift, and record-breaking low temperatures, resulting in more than 15,000 cold injuries, such as trench foot, pneumonia, and frostbite. I was from Buffalo. I thought I knew cold reflects Baseball Hall of Famer and World War II veteran Warren Spahn, but I didn't really know cold until the Battle of the Bulge. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton Jr. led the American offensive to restore the weakened front, sending in 230,000 soldiers and airborne units into Bastogne, where the Germans had surrounded thousands of Allied troops. When the Germans sent a message demanding the surrender of the 101st Airborne Division on December 22, 1944, they got a one-word answer from its commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and that word was nuts. 3 days later, Patton's Third Army finally arrived to push back the German line and rescue the surrounded troops. Germany's failure to divide American forces embedded in the Ardennes paved the way to victory for the Allies, but only at an egregiously high price. 1 million plus Allied troops fought in the Battle of the Bulge, with approximately 19,000 soldiers killed in action, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 plus missing and forever unaccounted for. The Germans suffered almost matching losses, making the Battle of the Bulge one of the bloodiest events of the war. The Yalta Conference and the fate of post-war Europe. Known as the Crimea Conference, or more popularly the Yalta Conference, the big three Allied leaders came together at a palace in the Black Sea resort town of Yalta to determine the post-war fate of Europe. Arriving on the 4th of February, 1945, and lasting for the next 7 days, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met at Levadia Palace to shape a post-war peace that represented not just a collective security order, but a plan to give self-determination to the liberated peoples of post-Nazi occupied Europe. Marking the third wartime meeting between the big three, by the time of the Yalta Conference, the Allies had liberated all of France and Belgium, with fighting now closing in on the western border of Germany, while in the east, Soviet forces were less than 40 miles from Berlin, having already pushed the Germans out of Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. During the talks, Stalin agreed to enter the Pacific War against Japan within 3 months after the fall of Germany, and since the Russians had suffered egregious losses to German aggression in both world wars, the group agreed that Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, the historical corridors for forces attempting to invade Russia, would remain in the Soviet sphere as a security buffer for a war-weary Soviet nation. The conference further set the boundaries for post-war occupation zones in Germany, including one for each 3 principal Allied nations attending the conference, along with a 4th zone for France, whose leader Charles de Gaulle was snubbed from the meeting, a diplomatic slight that caused a deep and lasting resentment in the French leader. Despite the fact that Berlin resided in the Soviet zone, the city was further divided into 4 zones of occupation, again by the principal Allied nations. A declaration of liberated Europe was also created by the Big Three, which encouraged the people of Europe to create democratic institutions of their own design and to hold free elections for governments responsive to the will of the people. Battle of Iwo Jima. A mere 750 miles from mainland Japan, Iwo Jima's 2 Japanese airfields made the island a perfect staging point for the Allies' potential invasion of the Empire of Japan. American military leaders felt that they could take the tiny South Pacific island in a matter of days, but in truth, the Japanese had secretly fortified the island with 21,000 troops and high-ground camouflaged artillery positions, along with fortified jungle bunkers and 11 miles of tunnels bored into the mountainous volcanic island. Beginning with punishing aerial bombardment and naval artillery fire that went on for 72 days, the United States Navy and Air Force did everything in their power to soften Japanese positions before ground troops were sent in to secure the island. Beginning on February 19, 1945, the U.S. Marines conducted massive amphibious landings on Iwo Jima, where they encountered steep dunes of soft volcanic ash, making footholds and vehicle passage treacherous at best. Playing along with the Allies' belief that the Allies' pre-landing bombardment had crushed Japanese defensive positions, commanding Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi held fire until a significant number of Marines had established a beachhead, finally opening up against the Americans from high-ground artillery fortifications. But despite heavy American casualties, the Marines soon captured both airfields, which was the core mission set forth by Marine Commander Howland Mad Smith. Within days, some 70,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima, outnumbering Japanese forces by 3 to 1. The next 5 weeks of fighting would become some of the bloodiest in World War II, with an estimated 25,000 Allied casualties and nearly 7,000 deaths. 4 days into the fighting, the Marines captured Mount Suribachi on the island's south side, famously raising an American flag at the summit, which was captured by AP photographer Joe Rosenthal, who later won a Pulitzer Prize for his iconic image. While Japanese forces were all but wiped out over the 5-week engagement, only 216 would be taken prisoner, some of whom were captured only after they were knocked unconscious or disabled at the time of their imprisonment. After the Allies' victory at Iwo Jima, neither the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Army ever used the island as a staging area, while the Air Force only used the rebuilt airfields for emergency landings, causing many post-war scholars to wonder if the Americans' sacrifices on Iwo Jima was worth the human toll. The Battle of Okinawa. With war in Europe in its final mop-up stages, mere weeks away from Germany's unconditional surrender, American forces in the Pacific Theater of Operations closed in on Okinawa's 466 square miles of mountainous jungles, with the knowledge that if Okinawa fell, so would the warring nation of Japan. At dawn on the morning of April 1, 1945, American troops aboard 5th Fleet warships expected an amphibious landing massacre far worse than the D-Day invasions at Normandy, only to find Okinawa's beachheads poorly defended by the Japanese. Within hours, American forces had secured both the Kadena and Yantan airfields, which were vital to the Allies' planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. As wave after wave of American forces pushed inland, they walked unwittingly into Commanding General Yoshijima's Shuri defense line, where his 130,000-man army launched crippling attacks from heavily fortified high-ground positions, leading to a string of bloody battles, which raged until late June, including Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe Ridge, Half Moon Hill, and the now infamous Hacksaw Ridge. Behind them on the South Pacific, with their backs against a collapsing war effort, on April 7th, Japan's mighty battleship the Yamato attempted a surprise attack on the 5th Fleet, with plans to wipe out American troops pinned down near the Shuri line, only to be discovered by Allied submarines, which led to its sinking during crippling air attacks, despite Japan's increasingly desperate reliance on kamikaze suicide pilots that caused massive losses to American lives and warships. Facing imminent defeat, many Japanese troops and Okinawan civilians committed ritual suicide under the false belief that Americans took no prisoners. Faced with the reality that additional fighting was futile, on June 22nd, General Yoshijima and his Chief of Staff General Cho also took their own lives, effectively ending the Battle of Okinawa. Both sides suffered egregious losses, including 49,000 casualties for the Americans, with some 12,520 killed in action, while the Japanese witnessed the death of an estimated 110,000 soldiers and 40,000 to 150,000 Okinawa civilians. The Allies would also lose 36 warships, with another 368 damaged and 763 aircraft shot down or destroyed, making the Battle of Okinawa the last major engagement during World War II, before nuclear detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the Second World War. A standout hero at Hacksaw Ridge. Born in 1919 Lynchburg, Virginia, Desmond T. Doss was a conscientious cooperator, as he later described himself, and while he could have applied for a deferment from military service based on his religious refusal to bear arms, he joined the Army despite death threats and near constant harassment during boot camp, both from his enlisted compatriots up to his commanding officers. Refusing to buckle under pressure, Doss shipped out for the Pacific in 1944 as a medic with the 307th Infantry Regiment, fighting with his unit first in Guam, where he was awarded a Bronze Star for valor after he treated wounded men despite extreme jeopardy to his life. He earned a second Bronze Star for his unwavering performance during firefights on Leyte, where his courage under fire saved countless lives despite heavy and intense mortar fire, grenade strikes, and machine gun fire. By the time Doss and his unit moved to Okinawa, any reservations by his fellow soldiers about the medic's courage under fire had turned to deep respect, which only intensified on May 2, 1945, when American soldiers attacked Japanese fortifications atop the 400-foot-tall Hacksaw Ridge during the Battle of Okinawa. At the top of the cliff face stood a 35-foot granite overhang, forcing men of the 307th to climb cargo netting to reach entrenched Japanese forces above. Men dropped like flies under a hail of Japanese machine gun fire, and over the next several days of dogged fighting, Doss put himself in continuous mortal danger in his attempts to aid his fallen comrades. On May 5th, the Japanese intensified their efforts to repel American forces, and when Doss's commanding officer ordered a retreat, he refused to leave an estimated 75 wounded men behind. Too injured to retreat on their own, Doss rescued all 75 men trapped at the top of Hacksaw Ridge, lowering them down with a rope until all men were brought to safety and much-needed medical care. Later that same month, Doss was wounded several times by grenade fragments and a sniper's bullet through an arm. Yet despite the severity of his injuries, he refused medical attention until those more seriously wounded could be tended to. Due to the extent of his injuries, Doss was evacuated in late May, returning home to Virginia, where he spent years recovering from his wounds, as well as tuberculosis, which he had contracted on Leyte. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Doss with the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony, where Truman said after awarding the medal that "I consider this a greater honor than being president." The only conscientious objector to receive America's highest combat medal, Doss later said that he won the medal because I kept the golden rule that we read in Matthew 7:12, that all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, making Desmond T. Doss a standout hero amongst a generation of standout American fighting men. The last days of Adolf Hitler. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was on the verge of total military collapse. Poland had fallen to the advancing Soviet Red Army, which was preparing to cross the Oder River between Kustrin and Frankfurt on der Oder, with the objective of capturing Berlin, 51 miles to the west. German forces had recently lost to the Allies in the Ardennes offensive in France, while British and Canadian forces were crossing the Rhine into the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr. U.S. forces in the south had captured Lorraine and were advancing toward Mainz, Mannheim, and the Rhine. German forces in Italy were withdrawing northward as they were pressed by the Allies as part of the spring offensive to advance across the Po and into the foothills of the Alps. In a nutshell, Germany's war effort was in a state of endgame. During an afternoon situation conference on April 22nd, Hitler suffered a total nervous breakdown when he was informed that the orders he had issued the previous day for an all-out counteroffensive had not been obeyed, leading Hitler to confess for the first time that Germany's war of aggression had finally been lost. Hitler then announced that he would stay in Berlin until the bitter end, taking his own life before the Allies could capture him alive. Luftwaffe chief Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring learned about Hitler's suicide pact and sent a telegram to Hitler asking for permission to take over the leadership of the Reich in accordance with Hitler's 1941 decree, naming him as his successor. Hitler's secretary Martin Bormann convinced Hitler that Göring was staging a coup, prompting Hitler to inform Göring that he would be executed immediately if he failed to surrender all of his posts. On April 28, Hitler received a BBC report originating from Reuters, stating that Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler had offered Germany's surrender to the advancing Allied armies, which further threw Hitler into an inconsolable rage. He ordered Himmler's immediate arrest before executing Himmler's SS representative Hermann Fegelein. During Fegelein's execution by firing squad, the Red Army breached Berlin's defensives as far as the Potsdamer Platz, and all indications were that they were preparing to storm the Chancellery. This report and Himmler's treachery prompted Hitler to make the final decisions of his life. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, he married longtime girlfriend Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony in the map room of his bunker. Hitler then hosted a modest wedding breakfast with his wife, before taking Secretary Trottel Young to another room to dictate his last will and testament. The following day, Hitler appeared in a bunker corridor to offer his final farewell to about 20 assembled people, shaking hands with each of them before retiring to his quarters for the final moments of his life. Hitler chose a pistol and poison method, which was suggested by his physician, while Eva Braun chose cyanide alone. Per Hitler's orders, both their bodies were dragged into a garden outside the bunker, doused in gasoline and set on fire. Records in the Soviet archives show that their burned remains were recovered and interred in successive locations until 1946, only to be exhumed yet again in 1970, so that their cremated remains could be scattered to an uncaring wind. An American aircrew's miraculous final flight. Having survived 8 emergency landings and 1 shoot-down at Vipitino, Italy, the seemingly luckless B-24 aircrew of 10 brave men hit the ultimate luckless lottery on the final day of the air war in Europe, when heavy, accurate, and intense German anti-aircraft fire over Linz, Austria, knocked out 3 of their 4 engines. The ship was a mess, replete with a shot-out radio and oxygen system, a punctured and drained No. 4 fuel tank, a damaged right landing gear, and a top turret gunner wounded yet lucky to be alive. After the crew gutted the plane of all non-essential deadweight, including parachutes, pilot Bill Shreve dropped out of formation before he and his crew lost consciousness at altitude, desperately scanning the Hungarian countryside for any survivable place for a near-dead-stick landing. What they found was an abandoned German fighter base at Pech, Hungary, with a 2,500-foot runway, which immediately posed a significant problem for a heavy bomber accustomed to landing on airstrips twice its length. Knowing he had no other alternative, Shreve landed the plane over a B-17 heavy bomber that had just ground-looped when it too ran out of tarmac, obliging Shreve and co-pilot Bob Carter to stand on the brakes for a crash landing at the opposite end of the airfield. While crash landing survival rates aboard B-24 Liberators stood at a miserably low percentile throughout World War II, all 10 men aboard survived, including navigator Jerry Harriman, fill-in bombardier Frank Dietrich, flight engineer Cal Page, radio operator Wally Anderson, and gunners Carl Nickler, Don Wood, James Herndon, and Fred Whiteman. The crew was immediately set upon by Allied Russian soldats who had invaded Hungary 2 months earlier, taking the weary airmen to the Nader Grand Hotel for a much-needed meal and a good night's sleep. The next day, the downed airmen's odyssey turned surreal when they were given 3 days' worth of food, consisting of 6 loaves of black bread, 10 lengths of smoked sausage, and 1 slab of raw sow belly. Their escort was a Russian Oberlieutenant who resembled Stalin so closely that the Americans nicknamed him Joe. They boarded a train packed with Russian soldats returning to their mother country, who soon began pouring full glasses of wine for the Americans, offering toast after toast until the airmen became quite intoxicated. After Joe had consumed an equal quantity of booze, he began hitting on a local Hungarian woman, which caused several fights to break out among the Russians and the Hungarians aboard. In all their drunken rivalry, Joe and the airmen missed their getting-off point, forcing them to bivouac in a bombed-out rail station 50 miles in the wrong direction, listening all night long to front-line artillery fire at the nearby Austrian border. After several days of traveling by horse cart through heavily bombed-out Hungarian cities, the wayward airmen finally hitched a ride with a Russian artillery convoy heading back toward Russia. Frank Dietrich wrote of the convoy, "The drivers were well loaded with wine and we drove at 60 miles an hour down bad roads. Our truck was in a bad way and soon we stopped to repair a flat tire. The tools were taken out, a 5-gallon can of wine and a chessboard. While the driver worked on the tire, we shot at a nearby telephone pole with all the weapons we could find, drank wine, played chess until the Russians began a rousing game of tossing live hand grenades. A short distance ahead, a jeep was also being repaired. It was dusk and soon became rather dark. At this point, the Russian repairing the jeep was in need of more light to complete his work, so he simply set fire to a barn a short distance away. Light was plentiful after that. After days of misadventure, the airmen finally arrived into Odessa, Russia on May 7, 1945, 1 day before the formal end of war in Europe. 53 years later, Frank Dietrich and his daughter Donnie Bastiani would return to Pech, Hungary in search of where his plane went down, and after hailing a taxi at the Pech airport for the drive to the same hotel where Dietrich was billeted after the crash, the taxi driver inquired in broken English about their reasons for coming to Hungary. When his passengers explained their objective, the driver pulled off the roadway in quite animated excitement, insisting that his mother had taken a picture of the bomber as it came into land. Undone by the small world serendipity of the moment, the driver drove to his mother's house, where she gave the picture to Frank and Donnie, closing out a vivid chapter in the lives of 10 brave men. VE Day. Following 6 years of bloody warfare, the Allies' punishing air and ground offensive at long last broke the back of the Nazi war machine. Heavy air attacks gained superiority over the German Luftwaffe, while repeated attacks on German oil refineries stopped the Nazis' mechanized ground advances in all fronts of the war in Europe. In March and April of 1945, Germany was in endgame as the Soviets closed in on the German capital of Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler and some of his top aides committed suicide, all but cementing the final collapse of the once dominant Nazi regime. On May the 8th, after the Allies accepted Germany's unconditional surrender of its armed forces, Allied nations erupted in mass celebration as the war in Europe came to a close. More than 1 million people celebrated on city streets throughout Great Britain, while crowds amassed in London's Trafalgar Square and up the Mall to Buckingham Palace, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth joined Prime Minister Winston Churchill on a palace balcony, whipping the crowds into a triumphant high note. The future Queen Elizabeth II and her sister Princess Margaret were allowed to wander incognito among the amassing crowds, taking in the frenzy of celebration like average women on the street. Coinciding with Harry Truman's 61st birthday, the sitting American president dedicated the victory to the memory of his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had died less than a month earlier from a catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage. As American cities erupted in celebration, by the end of the day, Truman confessed that the victory made it his most memorable birthday to date. In France, after years of Nazi occupation, the liberated French took to the streets in orderly jubilation, fully aware that better days were finally here to stay. While most celebrants felt the elation of victory in Europe, both Churchill and Truman tempered their citizens with the weighing truth that war against Japan had not yet been won. In his radio address on VE Day, Churchill told the British people that we may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but Japan remains unsubdued. In America, Truman's May 8th birthday broadcast said that the fall of the Nazis was a victory only halfway won. Operation Magic Carpet. By mid-1943, long before the defeat of Germany and Japan in World War II, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall began grappling with the logistical scope of repatriating more than 8 million servicemen and women to North America, all of them spread out across 4 continents and 55 theaters of war. At the head of the task was the War Shipping Administration, or WSA, which was established by President Franklin D. Roosevelt early in 1942, whose original charter was to increase the shipping tonnage of supplies and GIs by all branches of the U.S. military in both the European and Pacific theaters of war. In tandem with the U.S. Maritime Commission, led by Admiral Emory Land, from September 6, 1945, until September 1, 1946, Operation Magic Carpet would prove to be the largest combined air and sea lift ever organized in recorded history. While Operation Magic Carpet began ferrying U.S. personnel back from Europe in late June of 1945, the operation kicked into high gear after U.S. Navy ships joined the boat lift following the surrender of Japan, including the deployment of 70 aircraft carriers, which became the GI's travel mode of choice due to spacious accommodations and amenities, including movies in the hangar decks, fresh food, hot meals, sports, swimming, and an abundance of ice cream. Other GIs were ferried home in luxury aboard passenger liners like the Queen Mary, as well as an additional 29 troop ships used to deliver some 70,000 war brides and their children to their new homes in North America. As the months ticked by during Magic Carpet, the numbers of repatriated personnel reached astronomical proportions, while the overall average return rate during the course of Magic Carpet saw more than 22,000 Americans returned home each and every month. By way of comparison, during the course of war in Europe and Japan, an average 148,000 soldiers were transported into both theaters of war on a monthly basis, while post-VE and VJ Day repatriation saw more than 450,000 GIs returned home every month of the operation. From VE Day to September 1945, over 1.4 million soldiers were repatriated, while from October 1945 to April of 1946, the numbers swelled by another 3.3 million, establishing Operation Magic Carpet as the largest mass movement of humanity ever attempted or accomplished, setting the stage for the largest post-war baby boom in American history. The Potsdam Declaration. While the objective of the Potsdam Conference of 1945 offered the chance for the Big Three Allied leaders to discuss the fate of post-war Europe, the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945, was an intentionally ambiguous demand for Japan's immediate and unconditional surrender. Until newly minted U.S. President Harry S. Truman made his late appearance to the conference, at the insistence of the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. A ground invasion plan of Japan, known as Operation Downfall, had been widely discussed by Allied leaders, even though General Douglas MacArthur's own staff had resigned itself to an estimated 31,000 Allied casualties in the first month of combat alone. The Joint Chiefs were even more pessimistic, speculating that any successful invasion of Japan would come with an Allied death toll upwards of 500,000 lives. Ominously, the U.S. War Department had already ordered 500,000 Purple Heart medals in advance of the anticipated invasion. Instead, arriving to the meeting with news of a successful nuclear detonation at Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range in New Mexico, Truman confided to the other leaders that the U.S. had 2 ready nuclear bombs for deployment. After absorbing the news, the leaders landed on a strategy which rested on 4 sequential elements: the issuance of an ultimatum of surrender to Japan, which, if unheeded, would prompt the Americans to drop one of their nuclear bombs on a major Japanese city. Next would come the public declaration of war upon Japan by the USSR, followed by more nuclear strikes on Japan until the empire finally capitulated. The strategy was a bold-faced bluff, since the US had only 2 working nuclear bombs at the time, with a substantial lag time before any additional bombs could be made ready. On August 6, 1945, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island with a bomb nicknamed Little Boy in its bomb bay hold. Hiroshima was the primary target, with Kokura and Nagasaki as backup alternatives. The nuclear weapon was armed shortly before arriving over the target, which was then dropped and detonated at an altitude of 1,750 feet, instantly destroying a 4.7 square mile area while killing an estimated 80,000 people. When Japan failed to capitulate, on August 9th, America's second nuclear bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, while a third bomb was expected by August 19th. 4 days before delivery, Japanese Emperor Hirohito formally announced the surrender of Japan. The USS Indianapolis. Early in July 1945, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was ordered on a top-secret mission to deliver the uranium-235 core and other components for the atomic bomb intended for Hiroshima to the South Pacific island of Tinian. Following a successful delivery, the Indianapolis set sail for the island of Guam, where she would rejoin the rest of the American Pacific Fleet for their anticipated final push for Japan. Instead, shortly after midnight on July 29th, in low visibility conditions atop the Philippine Sea, the ship was struck by 2 torpedoes fired from a Japanese submarine, and while the ship's captain, Charles McVeigh, had requested an escort for protection, his request was denied due to the top-secret nature of her mission. Of the nearly 1,200 men aboard ship, when the Indianapolis rolled onto her side and sank in less than 12 minutes, 300 men went down with the ship, while 890 went into the water, in what would become a 4-day ordeal of hunger, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, exposure, and shark attacks.
From the net, I also noticed that everybody tied to the net. Sharks didn't attack. So every time the sharks were coming in, we would kick and scream and do things that we thought would drive the sharks away, and they did drive them away. The sharks only picked off, as far as I could see, the sharks only picked off people who had by themselves. In other words, no protection around them. And whenever they saw a shark, they were to yell "shark" and start screaming. And I don't know whether that was effective or not. The sharks didn't like us, so they would leave us. But the sharks were and they attacked in groups. And when they died, I just cut them loose from the group and let them float out to sea. I didn't want the bodies around.
Of the 1,196 crewmen aboard the USS Indianapolis, only 317 survived their 4-day ordeal through grit, courage, and determination. And while Captain McVeigh was court-martialed in what many believed was a case of scapegoating for the 3 naval officers who had received and failed to act upon the Indianapolis's distress call during her final moments above water. McVeigh committed suicide in 1968, while he was posthumously cleared of any wrongdoing in 1996, thanks to the dogged efforts of survivors, legal professionals, and ex-military personnel, making the USS Indianapolis disaster a study in sacrifice, courage, and fortitude during the final days of World War II. VJ Day. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, VE Day celebrations in the Allied nations of Europe and America were raucous and jubilant, subdued, however, by the knowledge that war raged on in the Pacific Theater. And while the noose was tightening on the Empire of Japan after bloody Allied victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese vowed to fight to the bitter end. In advance of an anticipated land invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, an invasion that would cost an estimated 1 million Allied lives, President Harry S. Truman decided over the moral reservations of Secretary of War Henry Stimson that a nuclear bomb detonation over a Japanese city would end Japan's resistance once and for all. Japan's continued belligerence after the first enriched uranium nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, taking the lives of an estimated 80,000 to 126,000 people. A second nuclear detonation over Nagasaki, this time a complex plutonium-239 nuclear detonation, finally brought Emperor Hirohito to the peace table.
Received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
This time around, after years of sacrifice, bloodshed, and grinding anxiety, citizens of the Allied nations celebrated the end of World War II with unabashed jubilation, including massive crowds in downtown London. In New York City, Times Square erupted like never before as sailors climbed lampposts to unfurl American flags under a snowstorm of ticker tape that rained down endlessly upon the celebrants. Small towns like North Platte, Nebraska witnessed fireworks, parades, and an abundance of confetti, while San Francisco and Honolulu saw marching bands, parades, and still more ticker tape. To many, however, VJ Day proved to be joyous yet bittersweet in light of the war's frequently indescribable destructiveness, taking the lives of more than 400,000 Americans and an estimated 65 million people worldwide. It was too much death to contemplate, historian Donald L. Miller wrote in his engaging book, The Story of World War II. Too much savagery and suffering. And on August 1945, no one was counting. For those who had seen the face of battle, and been in the camps and under the bombs, and had lived, there was a sense of immense relief. The war, at last, was over. Hiroshima, the day the world went nuclear. In July of 1945, after the Allies' defeat of Germany in Europe, physicists involved in America's top-secret Manhattan Project completed its first successful detonation of a plutonium nuclear bomb at the Trinity test site near Alamogordo, New Mexico. Japan, however, despite mounting evidence of her impending defeat, vowed to carry the fight to the bitter end in the Pacific, rejecting Allied demands for surrender as put forth in the Potsdam Declaration, which threatened Japanese leaders with prompt and utter destruction should they opt to refuse. In advance of an anticipated land invasion of the Empire of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, an invasion that would cost an estimated 1 million Allied lives, President Harry S. Truman decided over the moral reservations of Secretary of War Henry Stimson that a nuclear bomb detonation over a Japanese city would end Japan's belligerency once and for all. In response, war planners chose the city of Hiroshima, a manufacturing center some 500 miles west of Tokyo, with an estimated population of some 350,000 lives. After the 9,000-pound enriched uranium bomb, codenamed Little Boy, had been delivered to the Pacific island of Tinian and loaded aboard a modified B-29 christened Enola Gay, so named after the mother of its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Little Boy was dropped by parachute over Hiroshima, detonating at an altitude of 2,000 feet, instantly leveling 1 square mile of Hiroshima's city center, while fires caused by the detonation destroyed another 4 square miles in the days to come. The first nuclear bomb dropped on humans detonated with the equivalent force of 15,000 tons of TNT, forming a mushroom cloud roughly 60,000 feet tall, at the same time killing 80,000 to 126,000 people, while leaving many more thousands with burns and other life-threatening injuries. Birth defects and an array of cancers would plague local survivors for generations to come. After Japan's continued belligerence, a second, more complex plutonium-239 nuclear bomb, codenamed Fat Boy, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 39,000 to 80,000 people, while many thousands more suffered the same catastrophic burns and injuries as the victims of Hiroshima. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, leading to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, at the same time setting in motion a new form of geopolitical tension as Cold War superpowers developed nuclear arsenals under the ongoing threat of mutually assured destruction, making the day the world went nuclear a seemingly irreversible turning point in the history of man's ongoing inhumanity of war. The Nuremberg Trials. With the intent of bringing Nazi war criminals to justice, the Nuremberg trials were made up of 13 trials in heavily bombed-out Nuremberg, Germany, between 1945 and 1949, including defendants ranging from Nazi Party officials, military leaders, industrialists, and physicians indicted for crimes against peace and humanity, including the genocide of 6 million Jews and political dissidents, lost to Hitler's final solution. Until Germany's defeat in World War II, Nuremberg had been home to annual Nazi propaganda rallies, which made the location in the German state of Bavaria a symbolic end to the Third Reich. Absent from the trials was Nazi High Command Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, who had each committed suicide in the spring of 1945. During the first trial of major war criminals, all but 3 of the 21 defendants were found guilty. 12 received death sentences, 1 in absentia, while the remainder were handed down prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. 10 of the condemned were executed by hanging on October 16, 1946, while Hermann Göring took his own life the night before his execution by ingesting a cyanide capsule he had hidden inside a jar of skin medication. The executions were performed by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, who told a reporter from Time magazine that he was proud of his work. "The way I look at this hanging job," he said, "somebody's got to do it. 10 men in 103 minutes. That's fast work." 12 additional trials would be held, lasting from December 1946 through April of 1949, made up of U.S. military tribunals rather than the international tribunal that had passed judgment on the major Nazi leaders during the opening trial. Considered highly controversial from the start, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Harlan Stone called the proceedings a sanctimonious fraud and a high-grade lynching party, while Associate U.S. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas maintained that the Allies had substituted power for principle in the meting out of justice at Nuremberg. The Japanese holdouts of World War II. Of the more than 6 million men who fought in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II, given the remote nature of many South Pacific battlefields, some soldiers failed to get the memo that the war had ended on August 15, 1945. Japanese holdouts either doubted the veracity of the formal surrender of Japan or simply failed to receive any form of communication that their war against the Allies had been lost. For instance, on January 1, 1946, 20 Japanese soldiers hiding in a tunnel on Corregidor Island surrendered to U.S. servicemen after learning the war had ended from a newspaper they found while collecting fresh water. In late March of 1947, Lieutenant Ai Yamaguchi and his corps of 33 soldiers emerged on Peleliu to attack a U.S. Marine Corps detachment stationed on the island, believing the war was still underway. Reinforcements were sent in, along with a Japanese admiral who was able to convince the men that the war was finally over. Notable holdouts continued to surrender into the 1950s and 60s, including Private Bunzo Minagawa, who held out on Guam until May 1960, and Sergeant Masashi Ito, Minagawa's superior, who surrendered days later on May 23, 1960, almost 15 years after Japan's formal surrender. Miraculously, some Japanese servicemen continued the fight into the 1970s, including Sergeant Soichi Yoko, who served under Masashi Ito when he was finally captured on Guam. In October of 1972, Private First Class Kenichi Kozuka held out with Lieutenant Onoda for 28 years, until he was killed in a shootout with Philippine police. In March of 1974, a full 29 years after the end of the war, Lieutenant Hiro Onoda surrendered on Lubang after holding out on the island since December of 1944, refusing to surrender until he was relieved of duty by his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had flown to Lubang to formally relieve Onoda. And last but not least, Private Teru Nagamura was discovered by the Indonesian Air Force on Morotai, surrendering to a search party on December 18, 1974, a full 29 years, 3 months, and 16 days after the Japanese instrument of surrender was signed. Now that's a committed patriot.